And in this wise they talked on, fathoming the wishes of God, predicting his judgments, describing him as interested in matters which assuredly concern him but little. All was said with the utmost care and discretion, but every word uttered by the holy woman in her nun's garb weakened the indignant resistance of the courtesan. Then the conversation drifted somewhat, and the nun began to talk of the convents of her order, of her superior, of herself, and of her fragile little neighbor, Sister Saint-Nicephore. They had been sent for from Havre to nurse the hundreds of soldiers who were in hospitals, stricken with smallpox. She described these wretched invalids and their malady, and while they themselves were detained on their way by the caprices of the Prussian officer, scores of Frenchmen might be dying whom they would otherwise have saved, for the nursing of soldiers was the old nun's specialty. She had been in the Crimea, in Italy, in Austria, and as she told the story of her campaigns, she revealed herself as one of those holy sisters of the fife and drum who seemed designed by nature to follow camps, to snatch the wounded from amid the strife of battle, and to quell with a word, more effectually than any general, the rough and insubordinate troopers. A masterful woman, her seamed and pitted face itself an image of the devastations of war. No one spoke when she had finished, for fear of spoiling the excellent effect of her words. As soon as the meal was over, the travellers retired to their rooms, whence they emerged the following day at a late hour of the morning. Luncheon passed off quietly. The seed sown the preceding evening was being given time to germinate and bring forth fruit. In the afternoon the Countess proposed a walk. Then the Count, as had been arranged beforehand, took Boule de Suif's arm, and walked with her at some distance behind the rest. He began talking to her in that familiar, paternal, slightly contemptuous tone which men of his class adopt in speaking to women like her, calling her, "My dear child," and talking down to her from the height of his exalted social position and stainless reputation. He came straight to the point. "So you prefer to leave us here, exposed like yourself to all the violence which would follow on a repulse of the Prussian troops, rather than consent to surrender yourself, as you have done so many times in your life?" The girl did not reply. He tried kindness, argument, sentiment. He still bore himself as Count, even while adopting, when desirable, an attitude of gallantry, and making pretty, nay, even tender speeches. He exalted the service she would render them, spoke of their gratitude, then suddenly using the familiar thou, "And you know, my dear, he could boast then of having made a conquest of a pretty girl such as he won't often find in his own country." Boule de Suif did not answer, and joined the rest of the party. As soon as they returned, she went to her room, and was seen no more. The general anxiety was at its height. What would she do? If she still resisted, how awkward for them all! The dinner hour struck. They waited for her in vain. At last Monsieur Follenvie entered, announcing that Mademoiselle Rousset was not well, and that they might sit down to table. They all pricked up their ears. The Count drew near the innkeeper and whispered, "Is it all right?" "Yes." Out of regard for propriety, he said nothing to his companions, but merely nodded slightly toward them. A great sigh of relief went up from all breasts. Every face was lighted up with joy. "By Gad!" shouted Loiseau, "I'll stand champagne all round, if there's any to be found in this place." And great was Madame Loiseau's dismay when the proprietor came back with 4 bottles in his hands. They had all suddenly become talkative and merry. A lively joy filled all hearts. The Count seemed to perceive for the first time that Madame Carré-Lamadon was charming. The manufacturer paid compliments to the Countess. The conversation was animated, sprightly, witty, and although many of the jokes were in the worst possible taste, all the company were amused by them, and none offended, indignation being dependent, like other emotions, on surroundings. And the mental atmosphere had gradually become filled with gross imaginings and unclean thoughts. At dessert, even the women indulged in discreetly worded allusions. Their glances were full of meaning. They had drunk much. The Count, who even in his moments of relaxation preserved a dignified demeanour, hit on a much-appreciated comparison of the condition of things with the termination of a winter spent in the icy solitude of the North Pole, and the joy of shipwrecked mariners who at last perceive a southward track opening out before their eyes. Loiseau, fairly in his element, rose to his feet, holding aloft a glass of champagne. "I drink to our deliverance!" he shouted. All stood up and greeted the toast with acclamation. Even the two good sisters yielded to the solicitations of the ladies, and consented to moisten their lips with the foaming wine, which they had never before tasted. They declared it was like effervescent lemonade, but with a pleasanter flavour. "It is a pity," said Loiseau, "that we have no piano. We might have had a quadrille." Cornudet had not spoken a word or made a movement. He seemed plunged in serious thoughts, and now and then tugged furiously at his great beard, as if trying to add still further to its length. At last, toward midnight, when they were about to separate, Loiseau, whose gait was far from steady, suddenly slapped him on the back, saying thickly, "You're not jolly tonight. Why are you so silent, old man?" Cornudet threw back his head, cast one swift and scornful glance over the assemblage, and answered, "I tell you all, you have done an infamous thing." He rose, reached for the door, and repeating, "Infamous!" disappeared. A chill fell on all. Loiseau himself looked foolish and disconcerted for a moment, but soon recovered his aplomb, and, writhing with laughter, exclaimed, "Really, you are all too green for anything." Pressed for an explanation, he related the mysteries of the corridor, whereat his listeners were largely amused. The ladies could hardly contain their delight. The Count and Monsieur Carré-Lamadon laughed till they cried. They could scarcely believe their ears. "What? You are sure? He wanted—" "I tell you I saw it with my own eyes." "And she refused?" "Because the Prussian was in the next room." "Surely you are mistaken." "I swear I'm telling you the truth." The Count was choking with laughter. The manufacturer held his sides. Loiseau continued, "So you may well imagine he doesn't think this evening's business at all amusing." And all three began to laugh again, choking, coughing, almost ill with merriment. Then they separated. But Madame Loiseau, who was nothing if not spiteful, remarked to her husband as they were on the way to bed that stuck-up little minx of a Carré-Lamadon had laughed on the wrong side of her mouth all the evening. "You know," she said, "when women run after uniforms, it's all the same to them whether the men who wear them are French or Prussian. It's perfectly sickening." The next morning the snow showed dazzling white under a clear winter sun. The coach, ready at last, waited before the door, while a flock of white pigeons, with pink eyes spotted in the centres with black, puffed out their white feathers and walked sedately between the legs of the 6 horses, picking at the steaming manure. The driver, wrapped in his sheepskin coat, was smoking a pipe on the box, and all the passengers, radiant with delight at their approaching departure, were putting up provisions for the remainder of the journey. They were waiting only for Boule de Suif. At last she appeared. She seemed rather shamefaced and embarrassed, and advanced with timid step toward her companions, who with one accord turned aside as if they had not seen her. The Count, with much dignity, took his wife by the arm and removed her from the unclean contact. The girl stood still, stupefied with astonishment. Then, plucking up courage, accosted the manufacturer's wife with a humble, "Good morning, madame," to which the other replied merely with a slight and insolent nod, accompanied by a look of outraged virtue. Everyone suddenly appeared extremely busy, and kept as far from Boule de Suif as if her skirts had been infected with some deadly disease. Then they hurried to the coach, followed by the despised courtesan, who, arriving last of all, silently took the place she had occupied during the first part of the journey. The rest seemed neither to see her or to know her, all save Madame Loiseau, who, glancing contemptuously in her direction, remarked half aloud to her husband, "What a mercy I am not sitting beside that creature!" The lumbering vehicle started on its way, and the journey began afresh. At first no one spoke. Boule de Suif dared not even raise her eyes. She felt at once indignant with her neighbors, and humiliated at having yielded to the Prussian into whose arms they had so hypocritically cast her. But the Countess, turning toward Madame Carré-Lamadon, soon broke the painful silence. "I think you know Madame de Trelles?" "Yes, she is a friend of mine." "Such a charming woman." "Delightful, exceptionally talented, and an artist to the fingertips. She sings marvellously and draws to perfection." The manufacturer was chatting with the Count, and amid the clatter of the window panes a word of their conversation was now and then distinguishable: shares, maturity, premium, time limit. Loiseau, who had abstracted from the inn the time-worn pack of cards, thick with the grease of 5 years' contact with half-wiped-off tables, started a game of bezique with his wife. The good sisters, taking up simultaneously the long rosaries hanging from their waists, made the sign of the cross, and began to mutter in unison interminable prayers, their lips moving ever more and more swiftly, as if they sought which should outdistance the other in the race of orisons. From time to time they kissed a medal and crossed themselves anew, then resumed their rapid and unintelligible murmur. Carnoudet sat still, lost in thought. At the end of 3 hours, Loiseau gathered up the cards, and remarked that he was hungry. His wife thereupon produced a parcel, tied with string, from which she extracted a piece of cold veal. This she cut into neat, thin slices, and both began to eat. "We may as well do the same," said the Countess. The rest agreed, and she unpacked the provisions which had been prepared for herself, the Count, and the Carré-Lamadon. In one of these oval dishes, the lids of which are decorated with an earthenware hare, by way of showing that a game pie lies within, was a succulent delicacy consisting of the brown flesh of the game, larded with strokes of bacon and flavored with other meats chopped fine. A solid wedge of Gruyère cheese, which had been wrapped in a newspaper, bore the imprint, "Items of News," on its rich oily surface. The two good sisters brought to light a hunk of sausage, smelling strongly of garlic, and Cornudet, plunging both hands at once into the capacious pockets of his loose overcoat, produced from one 4 hard-boiled eggs, and from the other a crust of bread. He removed the shells, threw them into the straw beneath his feet, and began to devour the eggs, letting morsels of the bright yellow yolk fall in his mighty beard, where they looked like stars. Boule de Suif, in the haste and confusion of her departure, had not thought of anything, and stifling with rage, she watched all these people placidly eating. At first, ill-suppressed wrath shook her whole person, and she opened her lips to shriek the truth at them, to overwhelm them with a volley of insults. But she could not utter a word, so choked was she with indignation. No one looked at her, no one thought of her. She felt herself swallowed up in the scorn of these virtuous creatures, who had first sacrificed, then rejected her as a thing useless and unclean. Then she remembered her big basket, full of the good things they had so greedily devoured. The 2 chickens coated in jelly, the pies, the pears, the 4 bottles of claret, and her fury broke forth like a cord that is overstrained, and she was on the verge of tears. She made terrible efforts at self-control, drew herself up, swallowed the sobs which choked her. But the tears rose nevertheless, shone at the brink of her eyelids, and soon 2 heavy drops coursed slowly down her cheeks. Others followed more quickly, like water filtering from a rock, and fell one after another on her rounded bosom. She sat upright with a fixed expression, her face pale and rigid, hoping desperately that no one saw her give way. But the Countess noticed that she was weeping, and with a sign drew her husband's attention to the fact. He shrugged his shoulders as if to say, "Well, what of it? It's not my fault." Madame Loiseau chuckled triumphantly and murmured, "She's weeping for shame." The 2 nuns had betaken themselves once more for their prayers, first wrapping the remainder of their sausage in paper. Then Cornudet, who was digesting his eggs, stretched his long legs under the opposite seat, threw himself back, folded his arms, smiled like a man who had just thought of a good joke, and began to whistle the Marseillaise. The faces of his neighbors clouded. The popular air evidently did not find favor with them. They grew nervous and irritable, and seemed ready to howl as a dog does at the sound of a barrel organ. Cornudet saw the discomfort he was creating, and whistled the louder. Sometimes he even hummed the words. Amour sacré de la patrie, conduit son tien, nos braves vengeurs. Liberté, liberté, chérie, combats avec tes défenseurs, combats avec tes défenseurs. The coach progressed more swiftly, the snow being harder now, and all the way to Dieppe, during the long dreary hours of the journey, first in the gathering dusk, then in the thick darkness, raising his voice above the rumbling of the vehicle, Cornudet continued with fierce obstinacy his vengeful and monotonous whistling, forcing his weary and exasperated hearers to follow the song from end to end, to recall every word of every line, as each was repeated over and over again with untiring persistency. And Boule de Suif still wept, and sometimes a sob she could not restrain was heard in the darkness between 2 verses of the song. End of Boule de Suif by Guy de Maupassant.